first time, so Bernadette and I know each other since a few years now. We have organized already some symposia, also one here at Ikoki called History for Physics. And her talk of today actually will go exactly in the same direction. So Bernadette is here, as you might have read on the email that circulated in the Ikoki list, as a visiting historian of physics from the Max Planck Institute of History of Science in Berlin. And she has been invited through the visiting program of KISS for the history of physics. Bernadette received her degree in mathematics at the University of Marburg, and then a PhD also in mathematics in Göttingen on the Wasserstein geometry and its application to quantum theory. Okay. After that, she moved to Berlin, where she still is a researcher on the history of physics, in particular under the supervision, so in the group of Alexander Bloom, on called the historical epistemology of the final theory program. I would like also to mention that Bernadette is a founding member of BRCP, the Association of Young Physicists, that will give public talks next weekend, not this one, the following one, so have a look if you want. And please, Bernadette, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Flavio, for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here today as a historian. For me, this is really something special to be welcomed as a historian of physics in an institute for physics. And that so many people actually showed up and seemed to be interested in what I might have to say. There seem to be even more people actually coming in. Maybe let's wait another moment. Okay. Yeah. Well, let's see how many people will remain when I give my talk on Monday.
Next time is Monday, so I forgot to talk.
Yeah, right.
Maybe you will advertise it then.
I can, if I remember.
Do you want it live?
I think it started. If it's okay for everybody. I mean, I don't mind. All right. Okay. So as you've heard, I'm going to give 2 talks while I'm here this week and next week. And this first talk is going to be about history of physics as a subject. So it's not really about research on history of physics, but it's I thought it'd be a good idea to introduce to you the topic, what we do. And then next week, I'm going to talk about my own research in the field of history of physics. So that's my plan for today. So Flavio has asked me to talk a bit about why history of physics is useful and interesting for physicists and how physicists can engage. But as I said, I think it could be worthwhile to say a few things on what is history of physics to begin with, because I think there might be some misconceptions, and then say a bit more about what is historical epistemology, because this is the kind of history that we do in Berlin, and that also in particular I'm trying to do. Okay, so let's start with what is history of physics. Maybe let's even start with what a common physicist usually thinks history of physics is. At least that's what I thought and what I perceive that many people think. So I think that many people believe that history of physics is or manifests itself in biographies of famous physicists that you may or may not want to read for leisurely reasons. That it appears in commemorative speeches of retired professors that share anecdotes of funny things that famous physicists did, or it's used for educational or outreach purposes, because the idea is that concepts are maybe a bit clearer, or the access is a bit easier. If you give some historical stories, then things are maybe also more interesting and more accessible. And another thing that's common, I think, is that history appears in form of introductory remarks in articles and books. Some sort of mandatory introduction that, okay, we started with this question and then it developed in this way and then this happened and then this happened and now we're here. This, or also to legitimize research questions, that you give a story on how people thought previously, and that's how the research question that we're going to pursue in this specific paper is interesting. So I think that this is what most people think history of physics is about, which is in general okay, but I do think that it shows that there's no real awareness or knowledge that history of physics is actually a field of research and an intellectual endeavor. And it's, yeah, it seems that it's not really taken seriously, but how can it be if it's not known that it's a field? Then, yeah, as I said, I think it's often misused for research propaganda. There's no accuracy in how stories are told. But I think that the most basic problem is actually the following attitude, namely that history is something that happened in the past, and therefore it's not relevant for us anymore because we've advanced since then, so why should we bother about something that is not as good as the state of the art right now? But I think it's not how history goes. It's not a linear story of progress. But even if it were, then history still has a lot to say. It tells us why things are the way they are today. And yeah, so the basic assumption a historian has is that science, physics in particular, is a human activity. And so to understand science, it's important to analyze this human activity in the context of its history. And well, it's clear that the working physicists can't provide this from their daily life because they're just busy with doing physics. But this is exactly what historians are there for. They work on the history of physics precisely for those reasons. And I think this is why I'm here, because I think, and Flavio also, and Marios, that it's important to talk to each other in the end and see what we've got to learn from each other. So what would like to convince you of in my talk today is that history of physics is actually a research field, and we think seriously about things and really try to understand things about the history of physics, but actually also about physics itself. Okay. So, yeah, so the next thing the next step I think is useful is to mention that there are actually several ways to do history. There's not just this one method or this one type of question. There's several ways to do history, and I think it's important to keep in mind also to know what to expect from which kind of history and what to learn from which kind of history, and just to have a bit of an overview about this. So in general, so my characterization of this is very simplified, of course, and the boundaries are not very clear always, but I think for our purpose this should fit. So in general, I would say one can distinguish between intellectual and institutional history of science. Let's begin with institutional history. This includes history of organizations such as universities and institutions like the ICOCI, but also the Austrian Academy of Science. Institutions like this then also international relations, like how scientific institutions participate in international relations and in science policy. And then there's this a bit fancy term and like hip term that's called political epistemology. It's also not, different people have different opinions on what this is. But I think in general one can say that the question pursued there go in the direction of how epistemological questions are instrumentalized politically. So that you can, so there's politics on the one side, then the institutions on another side, and yet the third side is the science, and how these three parties just interact with each other. But what I think is probably most interesting for physicists, more people coming in.
The more you talk, the more people come.
Yeah, maybe I should stop.
Perhaps you could explain and give an example for political epistemology. Is it like, so should we think of it like attempts where science is misused for politics? Like
Exactly. For example, yeah, stuff like this. Exactly. Okay. So on the other hand, so we have institutional history of science on the one hand, and then intellectual history, which is called also history of ideas. And as the name says, it's the historical development of ideas and knowledge, and also of the people who have the ideas and practice anything that's related to these ideas and this knowledge. So this includes biographies, but here I mean really scientific biographies. Biographies in the sense that also historians can later work with this biography and really extract historical stuff for their own historical work from it. And when doing history of ideas, you can focus on several aspects. So you can influence, for example, study the influence of material objects, such as if a new material, for example, is invented, and then from this material, like new sorts of experiments can be built, and these types of experiments have an influence on which kinds of things can be detected, and then which knowledge we can generate or extract from this. It's all effectively due to the invention of this material. So you can do this, but you can also focus on cultural circumstances or social circumstances, how they influenced the development of scientific knowledge and theories. The next thing you can do is you can focus on short periods or long periods, like centuries long. It's called also longue durée. It's when you see how a certain notion or concept has developed over centuries. That's quite hip at the moment, actually, longue durée approach. Then there's this thing that's called global intellectual history. That's a bit the attempt to go away from Eurocentric focus of science, and take into account that also actors from different continents and just people who are not all white men have contributed to the scientific discovery. That's also things that people really like to do these days. And then, of course, you can there's not only history of physics, there's also other sciences can be investigated, such as biology or medicine, chemistry, those kinds of things, obviously as well. And then there is something that's called history of knowledge, which I think is quite interesting also, because the idea here is that we take away the priority of how knowledge is constructed from science and say there are also other types of knowledge about the world. For example, indigenous knowledge or knowledge from people who were never able to study the actual science and had to invent their own stuff. And this goes under the banner of history of knowledge. And finally, what I think is most interesting to me, and maybe even most interesting to a physicist, is what's called historical epistemology. So it's, as the name says, it's the investigation of epistemological questions with historical methods. And I've devoted a whole chapter in my talk to this, so I will explain a bit more in a second. I just want to conclude this part by saying that again that historians do actually think about things. They write actual research paper and books, and I think there's this idea, and I think the same prejudice also holds for philosophers of science, that, well, it's those people who are maybe not smart enough for the actual science, or it's for retired professors that then can do some philosophy. But I think it's actually not that. It's just different kinds of people who do history or philosophy of science, right? It's people who have different kinds of questions and are interested in different kinds of things. But in the end, it's good to talk to each other, I believe. Okay. So let's talk a bit about what is historical epistemology. So as I said, it centers epistemological questions that are tried to be approached with historical methods. Yes?
I need to confess my ignorance. What does it mean?
I will get there. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. So first of all, let me say let me distinguish between epistemological questions. So it's first of all a philosophical question, and it's not, well, different kinds of philosophical questions than epistemological one, where like in the typical HPS or history and philosophy of physics kind of settings people talk about, and this is when you accept the truth of a certain theory or the truth of certain concepts, and then you investigate them philosophically.
Maybe it helps to say that episteme is science in Greek.
Ah.
Yes. Like psychology, it's about science.
So to break it down most simply, I would say that a typical epistemological question would be to ask, why is that true? Why do we believe that? Why does that make sense? In translating this to a historical context, I would say the corresponding question is, why have people believed this is true? And put this why a bit more precisely is, what were the historical circumstances that influenced why people believed something is true? So that's basically the realm where we put our questions in, and with how we try to think about things. Or a different way of putting it, it's the process of knowledge gain itself that's under consideration. And again, to distinguish it, maybe you have heard from about HPS kind of thing, which is history and philosophy of science. That's I think commonly practiced in the US. And I would characterize this as historically informed philosophy of science. So it's acknowledging that scientific knowledge is historically situated, so it's necessary to include or account for a historical context in which a certain scientific knowledge is practiced, but it's not really history, if you want. It's actually more mainstream and more common thing to do it to do HPS, but so in me today here, I would like to advertise a bit historical epistemology.
What does it opposes to? What would be an historically uninformed philosophy?
Well, that's practically what philosophers thought before Kuhn. It's they thought that knowledge just accumulates as it's logically interrelated, and you just gain more and more knowledge. But then you realized it's actually not so, but there are revolutions that really restructure the whole knowledge, and that you kind of start with a new system of knowledge. And so in this sense, you have to acknowledge that knowledge is historically situated. But you can also, I mean, there are still people today who do philosophy of science and don't care about history. People still do that. They just don't care. Yeah.
And would it be right to say that history then is some sort of bias in the way one makes philosophy about science?
Well, I would say history as uninformed history, historically uninformed philosophy would be a sort of bias. That's what I think, because history is actually, it's about to gauge, to really give a context, and the more context you give, the less biased you can be, I would say. All right. This is actually what we do in Berlin at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. So this WG is Wissenschaftsgeschichte, History of Science. And so there are different schools and different people do different things, but I'm not mentioning all of them, but I'm going to mention 3 people that I think have very interesting programs for physicists. So let me start with our former director, Lorraine Dawson. What her thing was, and still is, she's retired now, but she's still active, is the historization of really foundational notions and ideals of scientific practice, things that we wouldn't even question, that are really part of the very notion of science. And her work was really to show that even those notions are historical, that you have to see them as historically developed. And examples for those notions are rationality, objectivity, rules, observation, and proof. So that's one thing that people do in our institute. And then our other director, Jürgen Renn, he is more of a historian of physics, but his program is to have a longue durée approach to mechanics, to really do the whole development from ancient Egyptian beginning of math to quantum field theory. And his idea is to see science as a complex continuation of actually developmental psychology, of how cognitive aspects develop in human brains. And science is just a continuation of this. That's his program. In effect, he just did a lot of history of general relativity and quantum mechanics, but always having these things in mind. And finally, what we do in our group, which is led by Alexander Blum. So the title of the group, which is already quite programmatic, is Historical Epistemology of the Final Theory Program. And I think final theory is not a term that's really used by physicists, but it's I don't know, I think philosophers and historians somehow use it, and what we mean is some sort of like finalization of the program to put everything under a quantum banner, to put everything under a quantum umbrella, to quantize basically everything. And this program to quantize everything, including gravity, obviously, that's what we call final theory. The end product, the hypothetical end product of this. And typical questions that we pursue there is like a large chunk of our group thinks about the question, why did people think they're actually close to having a final theory in the middle of the 20th century? And a question that I'm personally very interested in and try to make my mind up is, how did non-empirical methodology and become historically possible? So you can maybe see that we have really concrete epistemological questions concerning the problems of contemporary physics, and that our approach is to really do a technically informed history to be able to really critically engage with contemporary physics, actually. Yes, please.
Can you give an example of a non-empirical methodology that is being used?
Well, I mean, I would say probably any theory that aims for unification on non-empirical belief can only be pursued with non-empirical methods, because you don't have any empirical data.
Even there is still the wish to.
Sure, but it's not.
Test.
That's the wish, exactly. That's why it works. Why people do it. It's the hope that it works. But up until then, it's non-empirical. So, I mean, there's several examples I could give. I could give contemporary examples, like string theory, for example. But there are also, I mean, from all of the century, there are examples. A case that I'm studying as good as I can is the case of unified field theory that was most prominently studied by Einstein. It's a classical field theory attempting to unify electromagnetism and gravitation on basis of a classical field theory. And Einstein's methodology was purely formal, in the sense that it was actually just math. He tried to invent mathematical formalisms to put these things together.
So, sorry, Bernadette, quantum mechanics wouldn't fit here, right?
No.
Quantum mechanics is opposite.
Yes, exactly. Quantum mechanics is a very good example for the opposite. Yeah.
And relativity is exactly one, which is non-empirical.
Well, that's a good.
The special one, you wrote a paper without references, nothing.
It's a good question. So you can argue like this, but it's a bit different, I would say, because he invented physical principles, and all along the way, he was able to test some of his hypotheses. Like he was able to test the redshift before he managed to write down his equations for general relativity. So it's a bit of a mix, actually. Exactly.
Okay, so then maybe special relativity is non-empirical.
It is. I think it's also counter-example special. It was an ongoing 30 years discussion before that.
Yeah.
With testing the ether hypothesis. So
Exactly. So he was just the end product of a long line of thinking.
There is the Michelson, whether he was aware of Michelson and Morley, because he gives controversial.
But even if he was not aware, I mean, there was still like a debate, and it was like really educated guessing, but very educated and empirically educated guessing, I would say.
On Monday you are talking exactly about this, right?
On Monday I will.
Talk on Monday at 11:30 here about
I think you were first.
Different, like final theory, is this synonymous with things like theory of everything or like unified theory, or is it more like some specialized term?
So I think there is not a precise definition given somewhere in an encyclopedia. So it's you can use it a bit as you want, I guess. So the way we use it is that final theory is thought more as a completion of this quantization program, and a theory of everything related to this final theory would be like additional rules how to apply this for everything else, to apply like, I don't know, more complex phenomena, how you can reduce them to this theory. But
I think everyone is aware of this, but perhaps I say it anyways. I mean, the problem of quantum gravity is the problem of solving a very specific physics question, and this is not the problem of finding the final theory or even assuming that such a thing exists.
Yeah, right. But that's true. But you can still like in the end, if you have such a theory, you can still interpret it in that way and see it. It's an aspect of it. That it's a final theory.
Well,
if you have
it. That as soon as someone finds the quantum theory of gravity, immediately new problems come up.
Sure.
New inconsistencies.
Exactly. It's more like a tendency or like something that people strive for, and an aspect of a theory. It's never a theory is a final theory. I agree.
So how much this term of a final theory is intertwined with the reductionism? Because I think this is exactly so. The example of quantum gravity somehow that we can reduce from the small we can base somehow. So.
I mean, as I said, there's not such a really fixed. I mean, you can also think of final theories, I guess, that are not reductionist in its nature. Yeah.
Just name some kind of programs that you would consider in this direction.
In which direction?
Like, for example, you named string theory as one empirical methodology that also has kind of the assumption that it's a final theory. Others, or?
I mean, as I said, so I don't think a theory is a final theory. It's more like a theory has the aspects of being a final theory also. So yeah, I think string theories are pushing this very much. Maybe if you have a theory of quantum gravity, maybe you can also regard it in that way. It's more thought in that way. Okay. So this is what I wanted to tell you, to brief you, so to say, about the types of questions that are interesting to us and the types of historical practices there are other than what we are doing, just so that you have an idea of what you can expect of historical research in general. And since Flavio has asked me to talk a bit about to give some reasons why history of physics is useful, I've tried to come up with a few arguments that I think why history of physics is useful for you guys. So first of all, I think I should say that history of physics is an independent field of research, so it does not have to be of use for physicists to be to be legitimized, right? And there are many historians of physics actually who insist that people are aware of this. But I mean, as you can probably see from the research questions that are interesting to us in our group in Berlin, we are very much interested in understanding physics actually. So anything that helps to understand physics is, I guess, of use, if you want.
Yeah, a very naive question. So let's say take another history of something else. I don't know. I have no clue about how history works. Somebody that doesn't know history of political science of the passage, would they go and talk to politicians?
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I think that politicians can benefit for the very same reasons. Yeah, I think you can just interchange words. It's what I think. I mean, I'm not an expert in history of politics, but actually just yesterday I heard a podcast on somebody who is a theoretician of politics and also historian of politics, and he had something super useful to say about what's going on nowadays. And I think just understanding also how it developed historically and how you can really, and also giving analytical categories to think about it really helps to make decisions also. And yeah.
And to what degree would they, talk to politicians because it's useful to them? In other words, is it useful for you to talk to us, to just sit back and study the history?
I guess it could be useful to just learn a bit more about what's going on, to just really like feed your own knowledge about, well, what's going on. The same reason why I'm here, just to learn about what physicists are doing these days, so that I'm not only stuck in my beginning of 20th century physics, right? In this sense.
If you care about what's going on now, in what sense is it history?
No, it's not then. It's just so that I know. Yeah. And I mean, in our case, it's because we really address epistemological questions that concern contemporary physics. So we have to know about contemporary physics if we can, so that we ask the right questions. Yeah, in this sense. Okay. Right, I said that. I said that too. Okay, that's a trivial statement. Just to having said that, anything you know you can be of use if you want. So other than that, I've collected, I think, 3 categories of reasons why I think history of physics is useful. The first one would be that it provides tools for critical engagement and logical analysis. So I've prepared a talk by Duhem. He said, the presentation of the history of a physical principle means at the same time the logical analysis of the same. And I agree with this. And tools for logical or critical analysis are always of help, obviously. But I think especially if you feel maybe that situations are in some sort of state of crisis, that some people see contemporary physics in, some people don't. But if you are wondering about, for example, the current state of physics, then I guess any tool for helping you approach this question is of help. The second point why I think it's useful is because I think it just deepens understanding of the current theories that you are working with. So first of all, because you just get to deal with thoughts and ideas of people who were there when the theory was being developed, who developed the theories. And just hearing how they thought about it just really makes you think, wow, okay, now I get it. And it really also helps to understand that there were debates about something, that things just didn't fall from the heavens, that people didn't agree about certain things, but that it really was a historical development, and things could have also happened differently, and I think that helps. What happened to me also, that there were specific aspects of theories that I've always found odd, and then learning a bit about the history, I realized, okay, now I know where it comes from, and it's not only odd to me, but it has been odd from the start. Actually, it's just still odd, but I never knew because it's just not taught really in a physics class, because there's also no time, I guess, to teach these things as well. So yeah, I would argue that dealing with the history of physics and engaging with it just deepens your understanding of the current theories. Then the next point that's closely related to understanding is meaning. That I think that historical context and knowledge just provides meaning. You know, the type of thing is that you knew how it worked before, but all of a sudden you just know what it means. I don't know if you can relate to this, but this like just understanding on a deeper level, just I think history is something that can really provide this this feeling of like, okay, I see. And a reason is also because you can access this extra level of meaning is because you're allowed also, not only that you hear from like the founders of theories about their developments or their thoughts, but also because you're allowed to ask different kinds of questions to the theory. And the answers can provide meaning. And then finally, it's my last point. It's, I guess, also a bit more obvious. I don't know why I wrote gauge there. I mean, obviously, it's a historical context can provide a bigger picture, and the bigger picture helps, I think, just situating knowledge and just, yeah, know a bit more about where it comes from and why. I think just this bigger picture argument, I think, also is true here. And I would like to quote Einstein, a quote that Flavio and me have been quoting for a couple of years, and I think it's just the best quote. It's from a letter to Rob Thornton in 1944, and he said there, "A knowledge of the historic and philosophic background gives that kind of independence from prejudices of his generation from which most scientists are suffering. This independence created by philosophical insight, and I think also historical epistemological insights can count here, is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker for truth." And I think this is very well put. And I think it really alters the way you do science also, if you have historical knowledge. And also regarding to this intellectual independence argument, I think that's what I meant with Gage, is that really the awareness that science is human made, and that it's in particular also okay to feel uncomfortable with a certain kind of knowledge that other people create. So it's not absolute. And this really helped me also a lot. I actually do have a final point, and this is that historians or historical work really has the role also to say things right. And I mean, I think it's common to just share anecdotes and, oh, you know, Bohr had said this and this, and Einstein was always thinking this and that. But it's really, I mean, you have to be very skeptical about these like shared anecdotes, and historians are the people who really tell the story right. And more than that, history can really make things visible. It can make people visible who were forgotten because they may have been female or not white, and they just make visible also just developments that were forgotten and influences that were forgotten. So I think it's also important for this and also helpful for contemporary practice to remember them again. Yeah, so all in all, I think you just can't think about things properly if you don't know their history. Right, yeah, that's pretty much what I had to say. Just thought to conclude briefly with some suggestions about how physicists and historians can interact. I mean, me being here and being able to talk to you and you listening patiently to me, this is a really great form of engagement, and I really thank you a lot for welcoming me. And yeah, I think it would be great if this could happen more often. I think just knowing about the existence of the field, that is really something that people do research on, and that it's serious. I think this helps a lot already. And yeah, take it seriously. Be open to what historians have to say. Get in contact. I think, but this also is a call out for historians, because I think they also need to reach out to physicists a bit more, definitely, and invite each other, give talks to each other. Maybe even include a historical talk at each conference, and not just a commemorative speech with anecdote, just an actual research talk. Read research articles. And yeah, one thing that could be interesting to you, I don't know, is that with 2 colleagues, we're starting like it's some sort of reading group that's hosted by a consortium of history departments, mostly US, and our plan is to read foundational research papers for the history of physics. So we're actually starting next Wednesday, and we're going to discuss Weild's foundational paper for well, unified field theory, but also foundational for gauge theory. It's called Gravitation und Elektron, oder ich weiß nicht mehr genau. Gravitation und Elektron, something like this. And we're going to read this, and it's really technical paper, so we really go through all the math, and that's the idea. And so if you're interested in joining this, you are happy. You can approach me anytime. And yeah, just to mention this History of Physics symposia that Flavio and I organized a few years back, and we're now having a special issue based on the same concept, so that we bring historians and physicists together to actually write research papers together. Each paper should be written by a historian and a physicist on the same topic. That's the idea. And yeah, I'm very much, so deadline is November, end of November. It's probably too short for you to submit something, I guess, but I'm very much looking forward to the contribution, and maybe it's interesting for you to read. Yeah, that's my suggestions. If you have more, I'm happy to hear about them. And yeah, now I'm happy to take more of your questions, and thanks a lot. Yeah.
I assume that they are not thought as completely isolated boxes, no? As two different ways of looking at it. And I was wondering if there is any concrete active research and up to which point the history of the evolving of physical ideas and theories can be understood isolated and as an internal evolution of how ideas, or it is much more contingent and it is much more dependent on economical, political, and social institutions moving around.
Yeah.
Because I think this is a very interesting topic.
So I think earlier historians of science really thought in that way, as you said, that history of ideas were really studied separate from other influences, from cultural influences and material stuff, and it's but this is changed, and nowadays there's made an effort to emphasize that ideas don't develop independently of their context. It's really important to include those other aspects as material and social and cultural and whatnot. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Regarding the usefulness for researchers, if I wanted to learn something about the history of physics that could be useful for my own research. So what I'm thinking now is, okay, people have used some sort of methods and they were fruitful. Some people tried methods, it didn't work, but why? Very abstractly, can you recommend some literature, or is there reviews, or like some sort of database of these historical tools?
Yeah. So I've made an effort to promote how useful it is, but there is a problem with this, and the problem is really that there really aren't many historians that are really capable of understanding contemporary physics, and are really that the history of physics that they're doing is really really related to contemporary stuff. So this is a problem, and it's also like, if any of you were doubting if you actually wanted to be a physicist but prefer to be a historian, then I can encourage you that you really need it, because people who are knowledgeable and capable of contemporary physics, I think there's a lot of stuff to be done still. And as of it, there's no such thing as a database. I don't know of these things. I mean, since we're putting together this special issue, we were also struggling to find people, to do the more modern stuff. It's really just single papers that and single individual scholars that you should reach out to or read their stuff. And if you're specifically interested, you could just like come to me and tell me what you're working on, and I can just suggest you some things. It's really a small field, unfortunately. So it's still important though, but still small yet.
I have two questions.
Flavio's taking the questions.
One is pedantic, I'm sorry, it's not at all, but I'm trying to understand a bit the difference between epistemology and history of physics. And you were talking a lot about historical epistemology. So, I don't know, how different, how would you characterize yourself?
Well, so I would say that I'm doing historical epistemology of physics. And it's a very philosophical way of doing history, but we're not doing philosophy, but we're doing history.
Some sort of logical application of some logical methodology to historical work.
So we have epistemological guiding questions, but what we do is we don't analyze them philosophically, but we really do use historical methods, and this means we go to archives and we really dig through all the stuff and see how things really happened.
Good. So the next question is exactly related to that. Do you think there is archival work to be done here at Coquille or physics departments?
Yes. I mean, of course. I mean, you have several archives here. You have, I think, the Schrödinger archive. The ÖAW has multiple archives. There's, and I think also the physics library of the physics department has some archives.
They have not been sufficient.
I think the archives of the more famous people, they have been researched. But of course, I mean, but it doesn't mean you can always find new stuff. If you have new questions, you can also find new stuff in the same archives. But there might also be archives of people who are maybe not so well investigated yet, or of people who are relevant for questions that they haven't been relevant for other questions that have been studied so far. But yeah, but I'm sure there's.
Archives per se is like
for some strange effect at the top, so you find a new sentence and can trigger it. I think it was
I switched. Yeah, I wanted to ask, you kind of answered that already, but you always hear about these hidden or papers who disappeared or no one can read anymore. So basically, when we do something, it might have been done already in the Soviet Union, but after the crash, no one remembered it. So is there research in this direction which has still impact on modern physics? Like reading old papers, maybe in other languages, which were maybe written in a different way than we talk today.
I mean, if there's a chance that somebody has already formalized the unified field theory and it was in Russian and no one, I mean, I don't think that you can expect like a sensation out of from these things, but I mean it's more like people discovering like physicists that have been forgotten and see, oh, I mean, you know, most of the people just contributed a small part, and then you realize, someone maybe has thought of this already at that point, and oh, yeah, more in this direction.
But has there ever been like a thing where something has been done and it actually gave a kick 50 years later to modern physics because some historian dug it up and understood that it is still an important?
I don't have an example in mind. I mean, in general, this could happen, of course. So there's a famous historian whose his name is Hasok Chan, and he's doing history of chemistry, and he claims a bit things like this, that he has discovered a few, like in his historical work, things that are relevant for contemporary chemistry. Really, since I'm not a chemist, I don't know. So in general, I guess this can happen, but it's I'm not sure. I don't have an example of this in mind right now.
So, what kind of insights does the field history of physics provide, for example, for the current hype, if you may call it, around quantum computing? Say in the historical context of classical computing, is there anything research in this direction that you could?
So there's as of now, there's not much research in this direction, but I know that some people are planning to do research in this direction. So yeah, but this is very contemporary, and historians usually, I think, as philosophers maybe also, or do they need some time to adapt? But so there's not much, maybe no research at all on the history of quantum computation. So yeah, and then I also don't know how impactful this can be, specifically.
I have a question about the object level, not the meta level. Is there any historical research on the history of the Bohr rule specifically? Because I have tried to find it, I couldn't, and I think the history is fascinating. It's like this fight between the Göttingen School of Quantum Mechanics and the Zurich School of Quantum Mechanics. And they found the rule before they understood what it meant.
I mean, the history of quantum mechanics has been very thoroughly investigated, especially by our institute in Berlin, and I'm sure there's also history done on this, because I think they really have done a very thorough history of quantum mechanics. And isn't it Carlo and John Heilbronn? Aren't they writing about this? Do you want to say something?
approach an historian that knows who's the person to approach, because Googling randomly is a bit difficult. It's not your field, especially also to decide what to learn sources interesting or trustworthy or not.
So first, thanks for the nice talk. Now, I think that certainly something you learn in history of physics has implications for science politics, I guess, as well. And so given that, I wonder somehow how the field of history of physics establishes some kind of objectivity. So I could imagine, for example, that given your political inclination, you might be inclined to pick certain physicists and study those and not others, and come to conclusions that are more one way than the other. Are there some mechanisms in play that ensure the kind of balanceness or objectivity?
I mean, I guess other than just, I don't know, just like unspoken law or something that you really should be aware that this doesn't happen.
Do you see a danger there as this happens? People try to motivate some political.
So I've never come across anything like this. The only thing that I've thought was funny is that, so my current Bible is a book on unified field theory by a Russian historian. His name is Vyshkin. And I mean, he writes very objectively to having said that. But he, like, every once in a while, he refers to Russian political actors like Lenin. And like, oh, Lenin, he has thought like this and this about this, and he has known, he had an insight on this already. But it has a bit the flavor that because that he maybe had to write that or something to be legit. But it's clear that it's okay, whatever, next sentence. Yeah. No, it's not unlikely. I don't think it's, but it's, yeah. But I mean, of course, there's always, I mean, I guess also similar case with philosophy, I guess, that that there is probably a danger, but I think it's just generally expected that you just don't do that. And if you do, then people would notice. Yeah, I guess that's why peer review exists, no? And hopefully works. Yeah, but in different countries, things may be different. I guess, yeah.
Also, thanks from my side for this very nice talk. My question maybe goes a little bit along these lines, but kind of as a method like this historical epistemology. How does it position itself kind of in the field of history or with different approaches, also with respect to philosophy and politics of science?
Well, I mean, I've tried to say that. So within history, it's a very philosophical way of doing history, right? It starts with an epistemological question and tries to answer this, approach this with historical methods. So it's history done in order to understand something epistemological. So to distinguish it from philosophy, I mean, of course, the boundaries are never clear cut. But so to distinguish it from philosophy, it's first of all, there are more philosophical questions than just epistemological ones. And I would say that you can do historically informed philosophy without going to archives and really do the archival historians kind of stuff. I think it's okay if you have read something in a book, how things were at that time, and you know some of the papers of that time, and so you are historically informed, and then you can do your philosophy.
So as a kind of, let's say, like basing it in philosophy of science or history, like we would kind of start with like insights from Kuhn, fire
You mean for historical epistemology? No, I think that would be more the philosophy people. I don't think we start with Kuhn really. I mean, I think the historically informed people start with Kuhn, like being aware that knowledge is really historically situated, and we really do. I mean, we do history, and that's we don't need Kuhn for that, so to say. We like our basic assumption is that science is a human activity and as such has a history, and so we look at the history. It's just that the historical questions that we ask are very philosophical. We really want to understand something about science, and not necessarily about historical context, but just how this context influenced science. So science is really at the end, the beginning and the end of all.
That's why I asked, because like the epistemological question itself seemed to be very kind of Kuhnian or like Feierabend, also Fleck inspired, kind of in the sense that they're like turning it around, looking at the history of it, instead of kind of doing the philosophy with it. So what is then like a base in like in kind of philosophy of history that kind of where this approach is based, like as a reference?
So I mean, the thing is also that I mean, you can see it that way if you want, and there's I don't think that everybody who does historical epistemology agrees on exactly what it is. It's more like I just try to give you an idea, and the rest is up to everybody to just do whatever feels best, I guess. Yeah.
Like to gauge as a lay person is like hard to kind of have an overview about different fields. So that's why I was kind of just asking, well, like, is there kind of a start of it, like a decade or like
yeah.
a initial point where one can point to or a person? Or
yeah, I mean, I think I can't really tell you when this started, so I'm not a historian of history of physics. But I can tell you that from what I know is that really our institute, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, were really the people pushing this idea of historical epistemology, and they wrote position papers on what they think it is, and they have a philosophy about it. And honestly, I just do what I do. Yeah. Yeah.
You seem, it seems, or in your talk, you seem to stress, be mainly interested in the progress or the successes of science. More recently, we observe also a backlash against science from whether it's climate change or vaccines or whatever. And is this something that is now also being, or what could you say about that from a historical perspective?
If that historically investigated, that yes. People are starting to doubt science? Yeah, I mean, I think for sure. I mean, actually, so my institute, we're having a series of colloquia every year, and the specific focus of this year is exactly this question. How it came about that people are doubting science, and what we can do about it. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's what I perceive is mostly people doing science communication who are wondering what they have done wrong and what they could do better, less than the historians. But of course, also I think there's a common sense that as a historian of science, we should be aware, and that it's somehow also our role to like be aware and knowledgeable about these things. But I'm not sure that it's really clear on what we can actually do. Yeah, but I think in any case, like our director Jürgen Renn, he has transformed his interest in the history of physics to an interest of a history of knowledge. He calls it history of knowledge for the Anthropocene. And he has actually now been granted another institute to just research questions related to this. So how we can use and see the knowledge that we have to tackle the questions of the Anthropocene. And there are also historians who work with them. Yeah.
Perhaps a last comment myself to address what you relevant to the whole topic of the day. So how can we profit, beneficial profit, mutual profit from historians and physicists? You are asking what do they gain from this, knowing the current physics, being in an institute that is doing state-of-the-art research in physics. And so I think that, so what is history is studying at a different, what was happening at a different time, but this becomes of interest only when there is change between these two times. So it can trigger new questions about the past, knowing what's perceived as accepted as truth of today. So if you know the epistemology of today, so you come to this institute and you figure out that Bell's inequalities are approached with a very empiricist and operational way now, approach. But if you look, and then this triggers why it is the case that they were instead motivated with a strong realist approach when they were developed. So you can ask, for instance, why it is the case that the perception throughout the time changed. If you know, so you know the starting point and you know the arrival point of today, you can actually ask what happened in between. So they can know that certain questions have become irrelevant or more relevant than they were not when they were developed. So if you only read the historical papers, you will not guess how it developed these ideas. Knowing the arrival point, it can help you formulate the questions of what happened in between. So I think that it's important to have the final state and the initial state to reconstruction in between for a story.
Yeah, so, okay. My sense, again, as somebody that hasn't thought about it, is that on the question of use, I don't know if we should be saying it like that because this is interesting.